Good morning to most. Good afternoon to the viewing audience across the pond. I am your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to What Fresh Hell, a new limited run show we're doing here with Deep State Cuba that gives you updates on the global geopolitical situation as we all prepare for the coming doom of World War III. If you are a returning listener, subscriber, or one of our very valued patrons, thank you so much for joining us. So for me, so early in the morning. If you are a new listener, thank you for taking the time to check this out. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It is a very passive gesture that goes a long way in promoting the channel. If you do enjoy all of the diverse programming we provide here on TIR and you'd like to join us for our champagne rooms or something we're going to be doing this week, movie night, then consider becoming a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber for as little as $3 a month or a one-time payment of $30 for the year. You get access to all that, and your small donation goes a long way in making sure we can continue to bring you all these shows. I showed you guys on the calendar in the open. We're doing 2 weeks of shows in 1 week. Insanity, you say? Maybe. The Trump administration has been a massive contradiction, and it can even be confusing to many passive viewers of political news. What is true? What is actually happening in Iran? In June, Trump triumphantly said that his bombing destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities, but we're in a war with Iran because they potentially have nuclear facilities. Despite a disastrous return to office that has dropped Trump's approval ratings to historic lows, he touts that he's got a record 100% approval. What do people approve of? This conflict with Iran is causing oil prices to soar and air travel to become more expensive and annoyingly time-consuming and slightly more dangerous. Trump has spent his administration admonishing every European U.S. ally, then asked for their support to be proxies in his war with Iran, as it becomes evidently clear that the U.S. is not equipped for another war in the Middle East. Now, Trump has once again, by Twitter decree, called for a 48-hour ultimatum to open up the Strait of Hormuz, or the U.S. and Israel will commit more war crimes that we will never be punished for. But nothing happened. Trump says the U.S. is negotiating, while Iran says no talks have taken place. Boots are being positioned to hit the ground, setting up U.S. troops for a potential slaughter in the Iranian terrain. I'll blame the earliness of the morning. Now, to have this discussion, we have the one, the only. He's your favorite Ewok torturer, Deep State Cuba.
Hello. Take that, Greedo.
I'm sorry I didn't wear a tie today. I feel like I failed you.
That's okay. It's even the Death Star has casual Tuesdays.
And coming all the way live from a secret bunker somewhere in the Midwest. I'm not even going to tell you what state. Please welcome from the Green and Red podcast, Bob Bazanko.
Hey, Jason. Another day in paradise.
And Bob is also dressed to the nines. So I am the odd man out here. Cuba and Bob, the people want to know. Donald Trump says, okay, Iran, you have 48 hours or else. 48 hours comes up and Donald Trump goes, okay, just because you guys are playing hardball with your silence, I'm going to back off. But, so what is going on with this backing off, Cuba?
So, after Trump made the ultimatum that he would level and destroy all Iranian energy generation stations, all the energy infrastructure, which is a war crime, attacking civilian infrastructure, that represents a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions. There is a gray area for dual use facilities, places that might be powering US military bases, defense industry, that sort of thing. But there's a number of the power generation facilities that Trump identified as targets, which are civilian only. So those strikes would certainly constitute a war crime and a new form of escalation. Incidentally, this is a tactic that has most recently been employed by Russia against Ukraine during the so-called electric war. Um, there was a period of time when Russia shifted its long-range attacks into the Ukrainian rear from military targets and command and control centers to the entire electrical grid. Any transmission or generation facilities, every power plant was hit except for the nuclear power plants. And the idea was to knock these out before winter to reduce the heating supply of Ukrainians, which would impose extremely harsh conditions, potential fatalities due to extreme weather. And this would be adapting that kind of war plan, that type of terroristic civilian first war plan into the Iranian context. The issue is that Iran has demonstrated quite effectively that it continues to have significant capabilities of its own for long distance strikes, and that massive amount of key infrastructure all along the Gulf, not just electric facilities, but desalinization plants and other key infrastructure nodes in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and of course Israel as well. All of these are vulnerable to Iranian attacks. In order to underline that this was not an idle threat, a group linked to a hacker collective linked to the Iranian government published detailed plans, blueprints, locations of the Israeli civilian water and power infrastructure, stations, transmission sites, nodes for for pipes and wires, and just put it out there. Let the Israelis know that all of this has already been targeted, identified, and can be wiped out if there is that kind of escalation against Iranian targets. If you turn us, if you bring us back to the Stone Age, we'll take you back to the Iron Age, or maybe worse. I think that the alarm that this triggered in Israel, but especially in the Gulf states, made it impossible for Trump to carry through on his threat. I think that he invented the idea there's some grand negotiation being carried on. The Iranians denied that there's any negotiations taking place. They denied that they're even talking to the Americans. That seems much more credible than Trump's position. Even the Israelis considered Trump to just be lying in order to buy time, settle down the markets. And also, I think that a very strong indicator that this is a fanciful position and we're nowhere near a diplomatic resolution to this outcome is the fact that the Marine Expeditionary Units that had been deployed, around which all of this speculation, are they going for Karg Island, or are they going to try to clear the coast around the Strait of Hormuz? They're still on their way. There's been an increase in traffic of C-17 Globemaster aircraft. There's a very, very big, ultramassive transporter fleet of the U.S. Air Force and the Department of Defense moving from the continental United States to Europe to the Middle East. So they're still positioning men and materiel in the region. Preparations for a ground strike for that kind of escalation are ongoing. I think that this is just a bluff because cannot see through that type of ultimatum without an unacceptably high price falling on his Gulf allies.
Bob, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Trump is in a trap of his own making. I think what the first reaction I had when I saw Trump's tweet is just how casual the world is now, where you can, publicly on social media promise a war crime and it's just met with a shrug. And everything Kuba said is right. This is also keep in mind, I think it's important, not new. The United States in the Vietnam War was blowing up hospitals and schools and clinics daily, and it's doing it by not non-lethal means, but by other means in Cuba right now, right? They're causing massive power outages, which is like killing people in ICUs. So this is where we are. Yesterday, I saw an interesting interview with Ehud Barak, former prime minister and Epstein's other BFF, who said that essentially Trump is mad. He said a ground invasion, a legitimate ground invasion would require 2 divisions and take months. So again, I haven't kind of looked at the terrain that closely, but in my mind, I keep thinking of like Dien Bien Phu. If the United States sends troops into the strait or into Karg Island, it's kind of in the open. Iran has fortified positions in the interior. I don't know. It's causing obviously intense economic dismay. Something that I saw today, which was really interesting. Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who's been pretty good on this, said that somebody bet on these futures markets 1.5 billion on an increase in the Standard and Poor's rating, and bet I think it was 192 million on the price of oil. And so Trump, and it just shows how insane and irrational the market is, right? Trump tweets something, the market falls 400 points, then he pulls back and the market goes up 600 points. There's no tether to reality at all. So here we are. It's such a bleak situation. I don't like the liberal like taco. Trump always chickens out. Now, Trump causes immense destruction, and it's just nihilistic, right? There's no real reason for it. There's no logic behind it. Even in the Gulf War, as fucked up as that was, I think there was a certain reasoning, at least, that Bush and Cheney and Wolfowitz and those guys had. Here, I don't know what it is, but yeah, the troops are still heading that way. The global economy, which is Iran's ultimate, I think, card, right? It can monkey wrench the global economy in ways far beyond its military capabilities. Although the military capabilities, I mean, we kind of keep thinking about that. We keep saying the United States is winning the war militarily. I mean, Iran has millions of these drones, which are really fairly easy to produce. These Shahed drones, and they cost like $35,000, whereas a Patriot missile costs, I don't know, what, 4 or 5 million, doesn't it? So Iran actually is doing a great job, actually, of causing destruction throughout the region. I saw an interview yesterday with a former Saudi intelligence chief, because the New York Times said that MBS is encouraging Trump to hit Iran, and which is the New York Times, right? And a former Saudi intelligence chief just absolutely refuted that, and so they all warned him against this. So he's alienated these allies in the region and put them in a bind and made them vulnerable. And every time he makes a statement that may seem conciliatory, he also basically tells Israel, to monkey wrench it. Israel will undermine these things too. So it's just a bleak situation.
Is this the moment that the U.S. has to cut some sort of ties with Israel, or that's just never going to happen because of the geopolitical relationship they have in the region?
I don't see it happening yet.
I think that this isn't the moment, because you don't have the right personnel. You don't have the right personalities and individuals in power. The influence of Israel across the spectrum of American policymaking and in the commanding heights of media and culture, that's been carefully cultivated for generations. Billions of dollars have been sunk into investments in different groups and informal networks. Arguably, the Epstein network is a kind of sub rosa auxiliary of AIPAC and all of the things that are happening out in the open. So the penetration of the American elite by these Israeli interests is quite profound. And you have certain segments of the American elite. Mike Huckabee is an excellent example, because he doesn't come from New York. He's not an Ivy League bloodsucker. He's, to the extent that one can describe a national level political leader in the United States, he is a man of the people, and he has this very American form of Protestant evangelical Christianity. And yet there's a affinity between the interests of this particular segment of the population and its leadership, which is significant, with the aims of the most radical variants of Israeli nationalism. I would say that there's significant diversity within Israel as to attitudes towards the United States and goals for the region. There was an excellent interview the other day between Tucker Carlson and Avraham Borg, I want to say, a former interim Israeli president and one of the older generation. He's kind of the youngest person that you could put in the Rabin, Shimon Peres, labor two-state solution, moderate Israeli set.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see how pained he is at the developments of Israel under Netanyahu and how he sees a very firm line between the older direction of Israeli politics and Israeli foreign policy and what we've seen since Netanyahu has been able to not just come to power, but he's been around for such a long time. He's a generational leader in Israel, and many young Israelis have only really known him as their national leader. So that type of figure can and did transform a society. And what the Israel that we're looking at now, and I know that many critics of Zionism argue that there's always been continuity ever since the Nakba. Those arguments aside, it can't be denied that the Netanyahu variant is a particularly malignant strain and particularly entwined with U.S. interests and capable of manipulating American policy in ways that labor governments before the previous Israeli administrations balked at, right? They stopped short of doing the sort of things that he has been willing to do and perhaps didn't even have the same abilities to influence the United States that he has. After all, when he arrived in D.C. During the Obama administration,
Mm-hmm.
in order to decry the JCPOA, that was unprecedented, right? Israeli prime ministers were supposed to deal with the United States as a government and not play partisan politics. Here he is clearly choosing a side and opting with the Republicans, which traditionally had been a little more skeptical of Israel, largely because of lingering anti-Semitism, rather than strict values differences. But they had been the more skeptical of the two parties about the alliance. Now we've seen that flip. And I think that the relationship, just like Netanyahu transformed the Israeli-American relationship, the next generation of American leaders, whoever they are going to respond. There's going to be a reaction. Trump is the last boomer president. And whether it's a Vance or Tucker Carlson style NatCon, or somebody from the progressive end of the Democratic Party, the next leader will have to, just for the sake of U.S. domestic politics, will have to reconsider the alliance with Israel. The numbers on approval among the American population towards Israel are quite damning. The older you go, the more support there is for Israel. But overall, for the first time, and this was before this war, the polling recorded that more Americans sympathized with the Palestinians than with the Israelis. And the younger you go, the bleaker the situation looks for the Israelis. On the right, it often sits cheek by jowl with virulent anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
On the left, you have criticism of Israel together with a much more sympathetic reading of the Muslim world. So the political environment for Israeli lobbying and for pro-Israeli voices is going to become much more unfavorable as this administration leaves office.
Have these laws been damning? These anything you say bad about Israel is anti-Semitism. Have those laws been damning, especially when it comes to the university sect?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, among young people, it's barely double digits, I think, the support of Israel. But I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I mean, the Democratic Party, lost in 2024 largely, I think, because of Israel. You can bury the autopsy all at once, but I think we know what it says. And, just the other day, they're starting to, you can start to see the media starting to give more attention to Josh Shapiro, who has said that, he's going to run a very openly pro-Israel campaign for president. And, you do have, I think you have an opportunity to make it a change. As you pointed out, the American people are just kind of tired of this, the money being spent. It keeps dragging the United States into wars. In the Middle East now, the United States is so heavily committed that it's, we can see the effect it's having here at home, along with Trump's repression. And, I used to live in Texas, and the entire campaign this fall is going to be this just anti-Muslim screed, within the state of Texas. They're already, Andy Ogles, this troglodyte from Tennessee, put out a tweet yesterday with himself dressed as somebody from the Crusades, saying that every Muslim has to go. So they've really created this really terrifying, the United States over the years has invested, who knows how much. I mean, the official aid, authorized by Congress is over $500 billion. The real numbers, I suspect, are much higher. And then you have like Huckabee, as you pointed out, talking about a greater Israel. You have Netanyahu showing these maps. There's our Israeli army units with little like flag decals of greater Israel. So, you're in a moment, which I think I said the other day, somewhat of my generation, it's remarkable that Israel is now in many ways a pariah state. And, that does create an opening, and you're seeing this, in some ways, but the far right has really harnessed this far more, so when you think about this, you think of Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massey and folks like that, who I think there is a significant, legitimate anti-Semitic point of view to it as well.
Yeah.
I've never believed in the kind of
legitimately anti-Semitic in the sense that
they are anti-Semitic, not that it's right to be anti-Semitic. No, that they actually. I mean, I agree with their policy positions, but I do think that there's a legit, in their minds, a real anti-Semitism behind it, right? I've never thought of the kind of the AIPAC, public opinion theory. I think the United States has always seen Israel, as kind of the cop on the beat, whatever phrase you want to use in that region. It's a security asset to do America's dirty work. Obviously, that's not working anymore, right? It's actually dragging the United States deeper into this muck. And, the thing I keep going back to is there are goals available there that you can do far short of what they're doing now. I mean, outside of giving Israel control over Iran, you kind of had what you needed. So I'm not sure what the end game here is. Trump is obviously not a rational actor. I think trying to apply any kind of reason. I have a friend who's an IR guy. And, he's always trying to put this and kind of create this idea that Trump has this strategy, not quite 3D chess stuff. He knows that, but I just don't see it. I just think it's monkeys throwing shit at the wall. I really do. And that's why it's so terrifying.
I mean, this anti-Semitism and anti-Israel point of view is also pretty big in the manosphere, which is something I didn't think we'd ever bring up on this show. But when we talk about ideological changes in the way people maybe understand the world, do you see that being kind of a factor as well, Kuba? Right now, I guess we're talking about the memeing of geopolitics, where Trump is turning himself into Chuck Norris circa 2005.
So the way that I see it is that we've had a roiling series of crises that have delegitimated the dominant frameworks for doing economic and foreign policy all across the West. And with that, the delegitimation of the traditional elite classes. You see new parties springing up all across Europe, and the parties that have dominated ever since the end of World War II, social democrats, Christian Democrats, just imploding everywhere, their support cratering. You have this incipient anti-EU tendency blossoming up across Europe. Brexit was perhaps the most severe emanation of that. But you have EU skeptic parties right in the core in France and Germany, the AFD, the Assemblée Nationale. And in the United States, whether it's MAGA, whether it's progressives, whether it's the manosphere, whether it's this podcast and sort of left-wing radicalism, you have different counter-systemic narratives that have broken through the monopoly, the previous Overton window, where you could go from being, I don't know, John McCain to John Kerry, right? And those were the goalposts. And no one within that dominant paradigm has a persuasive vision to shut down the extremes. They don't have an ability to even deliver an honest critique of what went wrong. As a result, fewer and fewer people are listening to them, younger people especially that haven't been habituated to treating the mainstream media or legacy parties or establishment political leaders as authorities. They're rejecting that, and they're instead looking to whoever they like the most, whoever's getting the most hits, whoever's trending. Thought leaders just get generated and discarded by the internet, by the algorithm. And to the extent that anyone is in control of these narratives, it's really the people who run the platforms and can put their thumbs on the scales of what gets more views, what gets less views. But even then, if you are presenting something that's easily falsifiable, something that resonates with too much with discredited establishment perspectives, you'll get rejected. And we're seeing that happen to Ben Shapiro in real time, right? He cannot adapt to this new world. So he says the same things. And as a result, he's getting spat out by his followers. The manosphere has the advantage that you don't come for the politics, you come for the misogyny, but you can get all the politics you want smuggled in that way. And I expect that you'll need to watch out if you're a political analyst or if you're trying to be an entrepreneur in this space for voices that are coming from unconventional areas, right? We saw the diabolical affinity between wellness groups and crystal yoga chicks with RFK and MAGA.
Mm-hmm.
That was unexpected, but it proved to be a very heady combination. I don't know where the new variants of this are going to come from. There's an interesting revival of EU sentiment that has come with the brinksmanship with Trump. A lot of young people are involved, and you've got this kind of like based Macron take around his promotion of the EU. Ironically, he's the most popular in places like Italy, Germany, and Spain, right? In France, he's down in the single digits. But it is a real sentiment. And it's precisely because the Trump is an establishment figure pushing an America First narrative. So the EU gains some oppositional cred as a result of that. Yeah, it's a very challenging time. And as we see more and more failures coming out of trying to do the old policies again and again, it's extremely difficult to predict what narratives are going to take, what's going to be the new QAnon.
Bob, are you going to drop the new QAnon on us?
We're in this weird situation where Trump essentially ran, almost as an isolationist, and that was popular, right?
Yeah.
That was the big juxtaposition, right? Kamala Harris is going to send your kids to die in a foreign war, probably in the Middle East, which I think was a legitimate position to take because she kind of told people she was willing to send your kids into a foreign war, possibly to die in the Middle East. And now Trump has done this flip. And it's weird because among his people, like the day before they were against this and the day after they're heavily for it. But it's not a popular war. Whether that matters, I'm not really sure it does. I actually don't think it does. But you began this by talking about the manosphere, which is actually something way better than I do. But things like I've noticed a few years ago, not to the level you did, but things like the MMA, the proliferation of gambling. I grew up in a culture where that was really prevalent, right? In Ohio, a bunch of Italians around here. So as kids, we were gambling all the time. And I think that's part of it. And in fact, to some degree, this insider trading and these predictive markets now are driving, I don't know how much, some of this, because Trump's kids are actually investing in it. Like I said, last night, there was a $1.5 billion bet won on the stock market and a $192 million bet made on the price of oil. So we are in this like kind of hyper competitive situation. And it is obviously driven by men. I've talked to younger men who talk about Nick Fuentes. It's strange too, because at one point I would have thought that a Republican who was attacking like George Bush or George Bush Jr. would have been a pariah within that party. But in fact, it just doesn't matter. I mean, these people have turned on them. You have this incel culture, which I guess is tied to like Hegseth and military culture. And it's amazing, right? Where you have Hegseth and Kid Rock, with their shirts off working out. And you have RFK, and then you have Hegseth doing pull-ups, and it's the country's run like a sixth grade boys' locker room, right? They're snapping towels at each other and they're giggling and making jokes. And I think we said there was a report that Mujtaba Khamenei was gay, and the White House was just making jokes and laughing about it like children. And you saw like Mark Wayne Mullen was just confirmed, and they're unrepentant, and Mullen, challenged Sean O'Brien to a fight in the Senate. Yeah. So yeah, it's everything. I've always been like a materialist, and now I don't know if that matters that much, because obviously economically, last thing I'll say is I used to always, one thing I've studied for 30 some years is what I call the ruling class, opposition to war. Like in Vietnam, Wall Street turned against the war, and that was kind of it. And, even in 2020, I think Wall Street finally told Trump, okay, we're done with you, right? We've had enough. In early 21 with the attack on the Capitol, I mean, the National Association of Manufacturers put out a statement calling for the 25th Amendment. And their silence right now has me actually very worried, because you would think that they would want stability. There was this old idea that global economy, global capitalism demanded stability, and we certainly don't have that now. So I'm not really sure where we are, but I think American culture, these young men, which, like I said, you understand better than I do, is contributing to this and letting Trump do all this stuff.
I mean, to me, it's kind of frightening when you bring up that. And, when I was writing that piece for Current Affairs, just when I thought I had every example, of kayfabe and Trump and all this other stuff, then my editor would say, "Oh, do you remember that time in the meeting where the journalist asked a question and the response was your mom, the press secretary?"
Karen Levin, yeah.
We thought the government was extremely dumbed down in 2000 to 2008, right, during Bush Jr.'s years. That was the joke. Again, the movie Idiocracy is supposed to be a depiction, a satire of America in the aughts. What happens when the world becomes the satire? What happens? I interviewed Vermin Supreme for a film festival.
I'm a big fan, yeah.
And I had to ask him this question quite seriously. I said, how can you be a satirist when the person you're satirizing maybe is better at satirizing themselves than you are? And, he actually had to think about that question. If you know Vermin, he's pretty quick-witted, and I think he knows the beats of the questions he's going to get. And he actually had to sit with that for a minute and break character a bit and be real with the idea that that's how far things have gotten, that all of us are sitting here kind of scratching our heads. But I feel like the powers that be are not pulling strings like this is all supposed to, nothing is going to plan. It feels like everything's going to shit because it is the sixth grade boys' locker room. Kuba.
So I think that the breakdown of those establishment narratives, unfortunately, have made all kinds of hard-fought Enlightenment, democratic, humanist, socialist moral positions seem cringe to young people because um, both George W. Bush and Barack Obama would say things like Islam is a religion of peace, Muslims are not all terrorists, we have an intrinsic, universal, common humanity, human rights are trans rights are human rights, women's rights are human rights, right? That was the Hillary Clinton famous line. Um, those values risk being discredited. And um, when you link that as well to the type of broad based democratic dumbing down that the internet brings about, and that American culture, sad to say, is unfortunately prone to because of its anti intellectual, every man's opinion is equal, right? Mistrust of expertise, mistrust of titles, the way that the right just trashes professors, the calls for viewpoint diversity, things like that on the right, which is there's this kind of ironic bell curve effect where actual morons trash professors and experts because they think that everybody's opinion is correct. And then at the other end of the spectrum, if you really are near the top of your field, then of course you're going to think the people around you don't know what they're talking about because you're better than they are, right? And there is some epistemic closure that is illegitimate in some departments, in some fields, in some schools that may have to do with um, HR reasons, that may have to do with just sociology of higher education, where in any department you promote your friends, you push out your enemies, and that often overlaps with political commitments, especially on particularly values laden issues, right? Like the it's hard to find a department where pro and anti-Israeli, pro and anti-Zionist professors and experts can sit comfortably and collegially side by side. Generally speaking, you have captured by one group or the other, and the other guys get purged. And this is terrible for not just the content of expertise, but the ability of people to sit with difference and tolerate disagreement. That's a hard won skill. It's not something that comes easily. If somebody disagrees with you on an important issue, then it's quite natural to for those emotions to come forward and to trigger a response where you're aggressively attacking them, you're delegitimizing their position, you're refusing to hear from them. It's hard to be bloodless and dispassionate when there's blood being splattered and plenty of passionately terrible decisions being made. But that is the essence of the vocation of searching for information, trying to understand what's true and what isn't, and parsing through different um, frameworks, ideas, ideologies, strategies to opt for the least bad form of future political development. I feel like in the West, that skill has been eroded over time. And instead, we have just dominance games and constant flexing over whether or not um, somebody is even allowed to speak. And to bring it back to Tucker Carlson, because I feel as though he's both an ascendant figure that's politically relevant at this moment, and he's also a great practitioner of certain kinds of information politics. He had an interview. When you see him going after a deserving target, it is hard not to like him. For instance, with him and Ted Cruz, or him and Mike Huckabee, he identifies the vulnerable points that they take, the arguments that don't make sense or that imply certain outrageous conclusions, and he forces them down that path. He doesn't let them back down. He hounds them. And I mean that as a compliment. It's a great debating tactic, and he doesn't even have to be dishonest in those circumstances, because it's the dishonesty of his interview subject that's being drawn into the light. When he, in his recent interview with, I believe it just came out yesterday, with the former acting Israeli president, he is speaking to a figure whose politics, I think, would actually be fairly sympathetic to our own views in a lot of ways. This is definitely a peace Israeli of the old Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin school. I know that's not enough for everyone, but it's great for me, right? It's a great starting point. That's where I would like the conversation to be. And Tucker Carlson is respectful. He is charming when appropriate. He gives space for disagreement. He looks like a good guy, which makes it all the more jarring when you go back and you see some interviews where he's peddling outright lies, where he's delivering things that he knows are untrue, but presenting them as facts in the service of a larger narrative that he's constructing for his own political ends. And even more galling is when he cuts to commercial and he's selling boomers some serious snake oil, right? That type of figure that understands the old way, right? That understands what it's like to engage with somebody honestly, to have a conversation, and to debate somebody, be able to hound them when they're being dishonest, when they're being mendacious. Like, that's an amazing skill set. And seeing it in the hands of a figure as deeply compromised and manipulative, this ideologically odious Machiavellian type, is quite dispiriting. And all the more so that many figures that are supposed to be the guiding lights of mainstream media and the people who help you interpret information, interpret events in the world, fall far short of his skill set.
Sometimes when I think about this historically, imagine the 1920s when you had, these televangelists like Tucker Carlson's Billy Sunday, and this is when you had kind of the development of celebrity culture. So you had Babe Ruth and all these people kind of like the wrestlers that you study. Something that I also think is important, because you mentioned kind of these campus wars, and what we're seeing now is like this mass failure of liberal institutions, universities, the media, law firms. And in my own experience as a professor, campuses aren't full of radicals, they're full of liberals. And, most of the problems on campuses come from the right. They're the ones who are attacking people and getting them fired. If you tweet about Charlie Kirk, you're fired. Tenure professors are getting shit canned over COVID restrictions and things like that. But the biggest problems I always had actually were self-described radicals. They studied labor history or women's history, and they come after you, especially on things like Israel. I mean, I was like, they came, today I would have been fired. This was 20 years ago. And I had, my dean and chair were getting pummeled with complaints about things I'd said publicly about Israel. And now you have this internal war. So people can't get together and focus on the real enemy. You'll see like a scholar named Laura Kipnis has written some really great stuff about Title IX. Title IX's become a club. It's become weaponized to go after people you don't like, right? And just by saying that, I am now obviously on that side, right? I'm one of them, right? So we are in this situation where there has become this tyranny, which is really terrifying, right? We're abandoning any idea of free thought and free speech, and you're allowing people like Charlie Kirk, who was getting people fired and forcing them to kind of, some of the people that Charlie Kirk went after contemplated suicide. They were getting death threats, and I think this does tie into what we're seeing right now in Iran, right? Because we have this culture now where everything is a game. People hate each other who don't even know each other. They don't even know why. They just hate each other, right? And so it's easy to like gin this up. And, I guess on the flip side, the hopeful part is that, it's not really working as well as you might think it would. The majority of Americans support Palestine. Big majority of Americans are against this war. If elections mean anything, I mean, I think the election itself has some, meaning. I don't think the consequences do, but in Texas, Talarico is a different kind of candidate. But at the same time, the National Democrats, Chuck Schumer is I think the biggest Zionist in America. So I'm not sure where we're going, but there's no real kind of oppositional resistance or oppositional culture right now. Even liberals fall prey to this. I mean, the Democrats' big argument right now is that the Republicans didn't use the proper process to go to this war, right? If they had only, and they did, they voted on it, and which you knew they were going to do. So we're in a really, really prickly situation, and the war itself is just not going well. It's an economic disaster. The straits are closed without effort right now, and there are ships who are turning their transponders off and paying Iran and yuan, and they're going through. So it's just on every level. I think it needs to be rebuilt. It just needs to be torn down and rebuilt, and we obviously don't have the time to do that.
Kuba, there was a question you wanted to address. I'm trying to find it.
So there was a question about which countries have the most exposure to the GCC, and what is the and how are other countries taking advantage? And I think that that's a fair enough paraphrase for me to begin. It's well understood that the vast majority of the energy exports leaving the Gulf are destined to East Asia, Japan, China, South Korea. Those are the countries with the greatest exposure. They're the ones who risk not price increases, but shortages. Ultimately, when we look at the energy crisis, there's regions that everyone's going to be affected because it's a global market, but ultimately it's a physical commodity. So it will not fall evenly. The reason that you pay more at the pump in the United States is not that there's a scarcity of energy in North America, but because there's a credible threat for American oil firms that they're going to just put everything on a tanker and ship it to the Japanese. The Japanese are willing to pay because they actually do face the possibility of shortages. They may just not have enough oil to run their economy, run their vehicles, their planes, the power generation that relies on oil or gas. So the East Asian countries are the most severely impacted. And because of the nature of contracts with providers and the ability to outbid for oil that's already out of the Strait of Hormuz, the most vulnerable ones are the developing economies, places like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia. There, you might have regional, or localized, or even national level shortages that break down the whole economy. If you're an energy producer, then these are good times. Iran, for instance, thanks to the sanctions relief that's being offered by the United States in order to try to steady markets, and to the fact that they are allowing their own oil to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, both volumes and prices for Iranian oil have increased. So they're making more money from their energy sector than they were before the war. The United States is actually creating the financial flows that might allow Iran to continue to drag out the war much longer than they expected initially, rather than destroying their ability to wage the conflict. Russia is a major producer, and I believe that we've talked earlier on a previous episode about how the Russian position is strengthened because of the increase of oil prices. There's also been sanctions relief on Russian oil. But there's a conflict between American and European interests, and especially American and Ukrainian interests, when it comes to Russian market access for Russian oil. The United States would like that oil to be available to replace oil from the Gulf, and natural gas from the Gulf as well. But the Ukrainians obviously see this as a threat in this conflict, in which they're at this point they are. I think that it would be too much to say that they're winning, but they've managed to shift the balance so that keeping the conflict going is much more costly to Russia than it's ever been previously. And they've also developed means to strike Russian targets deep in the interior through a combination of different tactical adjustments and technological improvements. They have developed, for instance, a drone called the Flamingo, which is a combination ballistic missile. So it's like a rocket that also has a drone attached to it, or a drone that has a rocket attached to it. It can travel very quickly through the rocket engine, but then it is a smart guided drone for target acquisition and destruction. They've been using this to strike industrial targets, and especially to strike the energy infrastructure that Russia uses to export and finance its conflict. Just yesterday, and this completely undercuts the attempts of the Trump administration to maintain the energy markets, calm them down. They struck a major Russian, the number one Russian Baltic oil distribution center at Primorsk. It has storage capacity for 5 million barrels, I believe, and 1.5 to 2 million barrels of storage was destroyed in the Ukrainian strike. They're also going after refineries, ports, other parts of Russian infrastructure, and they're going to accelerate those efforts because this has become a much more urgent need for them. Russia has this opportunity, but Ukraine is going to do everything in its power to prevent them from capitalizing on it. That was already part of their overall strategy, but now it has renewed emphasis. The Europeans are also doing something sneaky, which is going after the Russian shadow fleet. There's all of these tankers that take Russian oil into the market that operate with false papers and third country flags. And taking a card out of Trump's playbook, they're just stealing the oil. It's illegal, shouldn't be out there, violate sanctions. Plus, the simple geography, it's often sailing through European waters, in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic, and the North Sea. So they identify it. They get Swedish or Dutch or French commandos, helicopter in, seize the tanker. Now they have their oil. So these types of developments are going to shift the oil game in interesting and unpredictable ways. That's something that I would look out for. Russia, because it's not a trustworthy partner and because it has to depend on Europe for market access for large parts of its oil, it is not going to be able to take advantage of this as much as it might otherwise. Instead, the dependency on China as a buyer is probably going to deepen. That'll be offset by China's reliance on Russia now that there's fewer alternatives. While countries like Canada may take advantage of the situation, increase production, and use that to offset some of their economic damage. There's also been reports of fire at a refinery in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
That happened today, and right now nothing has been attributed. We don't know why it happened. Could be an accident. Could be incompetent. It's just incompetent.
To be honest, I agree.
Also,
this happens every spring. There's a refinery blows up every. No, I'm not kidding. It really does. It's there are no standards in Texas. There's no inspections, so I wouldn't attribute that to any kind of geopolitical. I mean, it could be, but
as a person that worked in the Gulf of Mexico, actually the same year as the
Deepwater
spill, yeah, I can attest to the lack of a certain amount of safety standards.
Yeah.
But
When I saw the story, I
you
said
go.
it's spring. So a refinery in Texas blew up. I forget if it was in Leak City or Pasadena. I don't remember. They're all over the place. I lived there for 30 years.
they are all over.
So that, I mean, it could, this isn't really even a market issue. How much oil does the U.S. get from the Middle East? It's in single digits. It's not a substantial amount. The U.S. is pretty self-sufficient actually in that. And Sridhar Parsi yesterday said he was talking to somebody in the Iranian oil industry who said they've increased their sales from 1.1 to 1.5 million barrels a day. And the price has gone from 47. So they're doing well. And then they had sanction relief, right? Who knew? All it took to get sanctions relief was to start blowing up Gulf, oil and
We would have done this years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Like, spent $4 trillion to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. So, yeah.
Here we only have time for a few questions. Kuba, Trump mentioned bombing desalination plants. You think they would go after those at this point? You earlier said that would be Armageddon type escalation.
Yes, it would be an extremely serious move to go after desalination plants, especially since the exposure is asymmetric. It's true that Iran has a few desalination plants that are important regionally within its country, but I don't think this is more than
No, it's not even close. No, it's not even close.
Whereas the desalination facilities in the Gulf countries, some of them are 80-90% dependent on desalination for drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
Israel as well. I think it's not quite so one-sided, but 30% seems, if I recall correctly, that's about the number.
In Iran, I think it's less than 10%. It's fairly minor compared to the rest. It's totally different. Yeah.
Here we go. This is from Prairie. I'm sorry.
It's an escalation that would do a lot of damage to all of the American allies, much more so than Iran. It's a very short-sighted move, but it's a kind of obvious Trump play.
This is from Prairie, our good friend from Nebraska, who you remember we met in New York when we did our New York live show. Hey, Kuba, do you think Ukraine will double down on attacking Russian oil and natural gas infrastructure? Or do you think global pressure will mount against them with Trump's war cutting off 20% of all oil?
I think that Trump has played all of his Ukraine cards. Right now, Ukraine does not receive any financial or military aid from the United States. Instead, there's a mechanism through which European powers and countries that want to help Ukraine pay the Americans for weapons that are then delivered to the Ukrainians. However, Trump has indicated that Middle Eastern allies, Israel, and the U.S. war on Iran takes priority over any deliveries through that mechanism. So, what good are the Americans? They're not giving you weapons. They're not even letting you buy weapons in case they want to use them for this conflict. They're constantly trashing you in public. They've humiliated your president repeatedly when Ukraine made the offer to send its drone specialists, anti-drone specialists, arguably the best trained and most capable in the world, to support American air defense in the Gulf region. Trump responds with a humiliating tweet. The last person we need help from is Zelensky. The Emiratis, who are much, much, much wiser than Trump on this, took up the Ukrainian offer and are working with them. The Emiratis have no interest in facilitating Russian oil and gas. After all that does is undercut their market share down the road. They don't need that energy to be delivered to the international market. The Europeans, they're divided in opinion, but most of them, especially the ones making EU-level decisions, prefer to see Russia weakened than secure those deliveries of Russian energy. So I don't think that there's a lot of pressure that can be applied to Ukraine to get this oil moving. The Ukrainians have shut off the Druzhba pipeline that was supplying Hungary, and we'll see if after the Hungarian elections, if Orban is out, then they might be willing to play ball with the new Hungarian government in exchange for European aid and the unblocking of a $90 billion loan to fund the Ukrainian war effort. But short to medium term, no reason. This situation actually intensifies the imperative for Ukrainians to go after as much energy infrastructure, energy export infrastructure in Russia as possible.
Bob, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think Ukraine has more leverage than it's had. It's the United States isn't helping it. It doesn't really owe America anything. It can produce interceptor drones really cheaply in high volume. So it has a place in the world right now that it had not had before. Keep in mind too, I think it's important. Last thing is in early October 2023, Saudi and Israel were seriously close to normalizing relations until October 7th, and now this recent round has just destroyed that. And years ago I wrote an article about George Bush, calling him the Manchurian candidate, and I've revised that. I've reprised it actually now. I mean, Trump in a lot of ways is like the Manchurian candidate here, just monkey wrenching the entire region and damaging his allies. And Israel doesn't want Trump to cut a deal, and they're gonna I believe the Ali Larjani murder was part of that, right? They were afraid Larjani was perceived as somebody who was actually a real diplomat, and may have actually been able to kind of create some kind of a détente or an accommodation with the U.S. And so they assassinate him out of fear of that. They're afraid peace will break out. Compared to the coup in Vietnam in 1963, Kennedy was afraid the Vietnam War might end, so they made sure that ZM was gone and created greater chaos to make sure that the United States stayed in that war for fear of losing. So I think Israel's kind of playing that kind of role right now, preventing any kind of accommodation there.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for brightening everyone's day.
Living La Vida Loca, man.
Thank you guys for coming on again. Bob, thank you so much. KUBA, once again, thank you for taking the time to keep us abreast of all the changing situation. Again, only a few days ago, 48-hour notice was given, and now it's gone. And negotiations are happening and not happening. And Cuba, what will happen in Cuba? So there's still many questions left. Thank you guys, and I'll see you guys later. We are out.